Hello everyone, and you're very welcome both to those of us in the room here today in UCC and to our audience who are joining us online. Thank you for tuning in or for joining here today. My name is Dr. Conor Mulva. I am Associate Professor in the School of History in University College Dublin, and I'd like to thank the conference organisers, both John Borganovo, who unfortunately can't be here today, and to Helene O'Keefe and all of the team here at UCC who've been working so hard behind the scenes to arrange this fantastic conference here today. And it's been long awaited to have something in person, both to mark this important centenary that through the decade of centenaries we asked, would it ever be marked and what would we do for the Civil War? And now we're here, and also post-COVID, to find ourselves back in a hybrid event like this. I'm not going to take up too much time today. I'd like to introduce our three speakers, and I'll introduce them all at the start so we can run through our papers. As per your programme, our first speaker here today is UCC's own Jérôme Anderville. He's going to speak on French military intelligence in Ireland 1919 to 23, from peace, conference to civil war. Jérôme is a lecturer in 20th century European history and European studies here at UCC. I won't go through his full biography, but just to point out some of the highlights of his recent publications, and also, I suppose, long-standing and well-known publications: The Catholic Church in Ireland, 1914 to 18, War and Politics; The Irish Factor, 1899 to 1919, Ireland's Strategic and Diplomatic Importance in Foreign Wars; and more recently, Ireland's Helping Hand to Europe, 1945 to 50, celebrating hunger from Normandy to Tirana, which was published in 2021. We're still flitting between the years of AC and BC with COVID. Moving on to our second speaker, Fergal McCluskey from St Mary's University College Belfast, will speak today on Charlie Daly and the significance of partition in the genesis of the Civil War. Fergal is originally from Dungannon and has published on Fenian and Ribbonism, and also on Tyrone 1921 to 25. He's also co-edited The Men Will Talk to Me, Ernie O'Malley interviews in the Northern Divisions in 2018, as well as looking at the lockout and revolution and counter-revolution in rural Ulster, as well as looking at the Belfast pogrom in a recent publication in Studi Irlandesi. Our third and final speaker today will be Jerry White of UCC and the Irish Defence Forces, or formerly the Irish Defence Forces, and he will talk of the occupation of Victoria Barracks in Cork on the 18th of May 1922, a compromise that failed. Jerry is a military historian and retired member of the Irish Defence Forces. He served 43 years in Collins Barracks in Cork, where he was instrumental in establishing the Barrack Museum. His main interest in Irish military history from 1913 to 23, and he's lectured in Ireland and the United Kingdom. Also, he has a strong association with the Western Front Association. His publications include The Barracks, A History of Victorian Collins Barracks, Baptised in Blood, The Formation of the Cork Brigade of the Irish Volunteers, and The Burning of Cork and a Great Sacrifice, Kirk servicemen who died in the Great War, with Evening Echo publications. So that's it in terms of introducing our speakers. I nearly robbed the first speaker's paper, so I'm going to make sure that stays where it is. I'll introduce Jérôme, and we'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So my paper is entitled French Military Intelligence in Ireland, 1919-1923, from the Peace Conference in Paris to the Civil War. It's some obscure episode concerning Ireland, but that took place in Paris. So, start like this. Now, this paper presents an assessment of the evolution of the Irish struggle for independence from the Paris Peace Conference in 1919 until the end of the Civil War in 1923 by the Deuxième Bureau, French Military Intelligence, in Paris. Archives in Paris reveal an unknown episode when a pro-treaty Irish general secretly visited the Deuxième Bureau to offer a military alliance directed against Britain shortly after the signing of the Anglo-Irish Treaty in London in December 1921. The episode sheds light on the Irish nationalist perceptions of geopolitics in Europe immediately after the First World War, and does much to justify British security concerns about an independent Ireland on its very doorstep. While French contemporary analysis of the Irish Civil War offer new sources that in fact largely confirm subsequent views expressed by historians. In December 1918, Sinn Féin won the general election in Ireland. The country was to become a republic, but the British government would have none of it. Sinn Féin managed to send a delegation headed by Sean T. O'Kelly to the Peace Conference in Paris, where it hoped to convince the Allied powers of Ireland's case. However, the French police described O'Kelly as, I quote, an Irish agitator, end quote, and instructions were given not to let him approach Woodrow Wilson, David Lloyd George, and Georges Clemenceau. The French also warned the British security team on that occasion. And yet it would appear that O'Kelly was achieving some notable success in Paris. On the 10th of March 1919, French naval intelligence got sensational news, namely that, I quote, the German government had recently asked the Vatican to stop supporting Irish insurgents in order for Berlin to prepare a rapprochement between England and Germany, end quote. According to the information obtained, O'Kelly was working closely with Cardinal Gibbons of Baltimore for the recognition of the Irish Republic, and the Sinn Féin delegation's approach to the members of the Peace Conference had caused a real stir. This French intelligence was perfectly credible, as Pope Benedict XV had been pro-Irish during the First World War. French naval intelligence also correctly pointed out that the Germans knew that unlike Paris, London was more favorably disposed towards Germany. It was therefore necessary for the Germans to avoid all conflict with England. The aim, obviously, being to get better peace terms in Paris. This ultimately meant that the Germans would not support their former Irish Republican allies in Paris. The international situation was therefore not evolving in the self-proclaimed Irish Republic's favour. In January 1919, the War of Independence against Britain began and lasted until July 1921, when a truce was concluded. On 6 December 1921, the Anglo-Irish Treaty was signed between the Irish and British delegations in London, and the Irish Free State would see the light on 6 December 1922. Irish nationalists were disappointed, as they did not get the republic they had hoped for, and as their country remained partitioned. Most surprisingly, it is at this juncture that they thought about a rapprochement with the French. On 26 January 1922, General J.J. Ginger O'Connell, the Assistant Chief of Irish Staff, entered the office of Colonel Charles Fournier, the Chief of the Deuxième Bureau, France's military intelligence in Paris. O'Connell informed him that his government was thinking of asking the French to train the army of the newly formed Irish state, and that Dublin would soon approach Paris in this regard. O'Connell added that his government did not wish to antagonize the British and that his visit should remain secret. Fournier did not commit himself, but Prime Minister Raymond Poincaré and Minister of War André Maginot were informed about this rather unusual visit. At the beginning of February, no precise date, O'Connell returned to the Deuxième Bureau in Paris, but this time with something quite different. He gave Fournier a document which was subsequently correctly defined by André Maginot as, I quote, a Franco-Irish alliance against England, end quote. The document consisted in 3 separate memoranda. It was stated in a general introduction that Irish officers could be trained in France and that the Deuxième Bureau could send French officers to Ireland with the aim of completing their information on that country. Memorandum A was entitled, I quote, a Franco-Irish Entente, in which the Irish authors explained that owing to conflicting geostrategic interests, France and Britain were heading for confrontation and that Ireland had an important role to play. I quote, the recent development of the Air Force and submarines allows to consider Ireland as the left flank of the French forces in a war against England. The best way to make Ireland establish a direct contact with France is aviation, and this must be developed on a large scale. The distance from Cork or Waterford to Brest or Cherbourg is not prohibitive, and the French have taken the lead in the development of aviation. From our side, we must not lose sight of the fact that Cork is exceptionally well located to become an airfield, and that our goal should be to develop it in that sense." Unquote. The Irish then stressed the fact that their country was more powerful than it looked. I quote, "We are a race that is spread out over the world and have an international power, particularly in America, which could be an important factor in France's favor." End quote. This Memorandum A had been written in December 1921, but there is no way of knowing if it had been written before or after the signing of the Anglo-Irish Treaty. Memorandum B was entitled "The French Argument" and was an analysis of the geostrategic situation between France, Britain and Ireland. The memorandum had been written in September 1921, so before the signing of the treaty. Memorandum C was entitled "Note on the French Colonial Empire in relation to the English one," and was in fact a development of Memorandum B. It seems to have been written after the signing of the treaty. A few remarks spring to mind about this mysterious episode. It is true that there had been some serious tensions between the French, the British and the Americans during the peace conference in Paris, and that the French were not entirely satisfied with the Versailles Treaty and the security guarantees given by London and Washington. But despite these serious diplomatic rows, Paris knew that Germany remained the main potential threat by very far. For Paris, London was still the main ally. Despite the appearances, the Irish had in fact seriously misread the international situation. The remark on the submarines sounded very much like a remake of Roger Casement's arguments to entice the Germans to support the Irish volunteers in their preparations for the Easter Rising. However, regarding French aviation, the Irish had a point. At the very end of the war, the First World War, France had over 3,400 planes and had even devised a new tactic of combined plane-tank attack. Now that, unfortunately, is a lesson that was lost in 1940, we would say. But the Irish had also a point when they emphasized that they were a world factor to be reckoned with. Before and during the First World War, the French ambassadors and consuls in Britain, the United States and the British Empire had pointed out that there was Ireland and then there was the Irish world. The problem was that the French and also the Germans had not been able to exploit this world to their benefit. But what this episode reveals above all is that some in Ireland were not ready to meet the obligations of the Anglo-Irish Treaty, among whom might well have been some who had actually signed it. O'Connell's document was in flagrant contradictions to Articles 6 and 7b of the treaty, which stipulated that the British remained in charge of the defence of the Isles. It remains a mystery who in Ireland had been behind O'Connell's visit to the Deuxième Bureau in Paris, because it would seem highly unlikely that he had taken the initiative on his own. Michael Collins emerges here as a likely suspect, as he was, after all, Director of Intelligence in the Republican movement, but it cannot be proven. Yet, it is relevant to point out that Collins had a strong interest in establishing military aviation. There is further relevant information about the British and the Irish during the treaty negotiations in London. Some in Britain feared that Ireland might be used by foreign powers as a base of attack on Britain, a century-old worry for the British, and indeed fully justified by history. Lord Trenchard, Marshal of the Royal Air Force, said in October 1921, I quote, "We want bases in Ireland for our aeroplanes, such as would be required for the defence of Britain," end quote. Trenchard declared that an attack launched by a continental European country might use aircraft routing around the west of Ireland, and we want to be in a position to put a squadron in Ireland to deal with an attack by air, end quote. Had Trenchard found out about O'Connell's mission in Paris, he would have felt fully vindicated. As to the Irish, on 4 December 1921, they suggested to the British to undertake themselves the defence of Ireland by sea, land and air, and to repulse by force any attempt to violate the integrity of the shores and territorial waters. This was an amendment for Article 7 of the future treaty, but the British negotiators categorically refused. Again, they would have felt fully vindicated had they known about O'Connell's secret visit to Paris. It would seem that Collins might have envisaged the use of planes against the British if war between Ireland and Britain resumed. French intelligence conducted investigations concerning O'Connell, and according to one of their sources, he was, I quote, a most remarkable, honest and intelligent man, more realistic than the Irish usually are, end quote. But in the end, the French never entered into a secret alliance with the Irish. O'Connell's mission to Paris remains shrouded in mystery, and finding explanations are speculative unless archives bring to light other documents. To finish this paper, a few remarks on how the French military attaché in London reported to the Deuxième Bureau in Paris on the Irish Civil War between 1922 and 1923, which was concisely defined by the historian Yunan O'Alpine as, I quote, a miserable and confused business. According to the same O'Alpine, I quote, the kindest thing that could be said for the government's military performance was that it was less bad than the opposition's, end quote. Général Artus de la Panouse, the French military attaché, had also reached that conclusion back then. Prior to the outbreak of the fighting, which began on 28 June, de la Panouse had sent reports to Paris outlining the situation. Handwritten annotations show that they reached Marshal Ferdinand Foch, the Allied overall commander, in 1918 on the Western Front. In January 1922, he wrote that open conflict between the Irish Provisional Government and the anti-treatyites, led by Eamon de Valera, was a distinct possibility. He gleaned some of his information from contacts in the British War Office. On 27 April, de la Panouse wrote that there was anarchy in a future Irish Free State, and that neither de Valera nor Collins were fully in control of their men. As far as the overall Republican strategy was concerned, it consisted in fomenting troubles among the National Army, which would force the provisional government to ask for British troop support. This, in turn, would bring discredit upon it by the population. This was a correct analysis by de la Panouse, and those Republicans who were occupying the four courts in Dublin were hoping that the British intervention would eventually reunite the pro-treatyites and anti-treatyites in Ireland, but that failed. On 3 July, de la Panouse informed the Deuxième Bureau that the National Army had taken the Four Courts building, but cautioned that it might not mean the end of the conflict yet, as de Valera could be problematic. He was right, as it was only the beginning of the fight. As for the British, he wrote that, according to the information he got at the War Office, they had reluctantly agreed to supply the Irish government with armament. They were not sure if it would be well used against the Republicans, and if, one day, it would not be used against them. Again, this was a correct analysis by de la Panouse. The British feared that the National Army could grow in strength and then possibly attack Northern Ireland. Collins had indeed this in mind in the spring of 1922. On 18 July, de la Panouse reported that groups of Republicans were looting, intimidating and terrorizing the population. He remarked, I quote, "One must take into account this curious Irish mentality, which means that those who are the victims of the insurgents do not bear a grudge against them." End quote. Don't know if that's correct. You can tell me. Everywhere where there was straightforward fighting, the Republicans were defeated by the National Army. He wrote that the Republicans would now probably resort to guerrilla tactics, meaning that the conflict could last long. He was right. The War Office, however, had told him that it believed the fighting would last for about another 2 months. It was wrong. De La Perouse noted that the repercussions of the civil war in the south were positive in Northern Ireland in the sense that the troublemakers had left Ulster to join their comrades down south. The province was now relatively quiet as a result. De La Perouse then commented on the quality of the combatants. I quote, "The present civil war shows that Irishmen are good soldiers only if they are well supervised. But the rebel troops lack inexperienced leaders, while the National Army disposes of a few officers who went through the Great War to train and command them. This explains its relatively easy successes." End quote. His assessment was largely accurate. The Republican generals were not the best. One of their main ones, Liam Lynch, believed that the war could go in the Republicans' favour if they had more armament, especially artillery, and that the submarine from Germany could even transport it. End quote. In October, the Provisional Government had introduced the Public Safety Act. This gave the National Army the power to try and execute Republicans who had not surrendered their arms. This escalation of brutality in the war did not escape de La Penouse's attention, and he did not mince his words. On 12 February 1923, he reported that the government and its army were using the same methods as the notorious Black and Tans during the War of Independence, but to no effect. He mentioned that in 3 or 4 weeks' time, the National Army had executed about 50 to 60 people, and added that it was regrettable to notice that most of these executions had something personal, and that it was about, I quote, particular vengeance, end quote. On the war in progress, he commented that the Free Staters were in control of urban areas, whereas the Republicans controlled parts of the countryside. He analysed that the young Free State Army was inexperienced and untrained for guerrilla warfare, and that it did not have an effective intelligence service. About the Republicans, he dryly wrote, I quote, "It is said that the Republicans have no plan. At least they have one which consists in making life impossible, especially in the countryside, for landowners, and in paralysing commerce and industry by destroying communication means." End quote. His analysis was largely correct. The Civil War came to an end in May 1923. On 18 June, de La Perouse sent his last report on the events and wrote, I quote, that the Republican Army's resistance can be regarded as broken, end quote. Only small bands remained, but the struggle was over. He rightly stated, I quote, "The Free State government is master of the situation in the sense that it is strong enough to maintain order, but it is not out of the woods yet, politically speaking," end of quote. Indeed, for many years to come, the memory of the Civil War bitterly divided Irish political life. Finally, between 1919 and 1923, French military and naval intelligence had obtained good information about Ireland and had assessed the situation appropriately. General de La Perouse had been a reliable and thorough analyst of the course of the country's political and military struggle. Certainly, the remarks he made would later largely be confirmed by historians. The findings in the military archives and the Foreign Ministry archives in France also do throw a new light on the historiography of the period under consideration. Finally, the O'Connell episode confirms that the British were right to consider an independent Ireland as a security concern. Thank you very much.
So, je dois dire que Pelouse a eu raison. Yeah, so the personal animosity, I thought following the talk about French military tactics would have absolutely no relevance to talk on Charlie Daly and the significance of partition and the genesis of the Civil War, but actually it is highly relevant, because what you will probably see from this is an awful lot of the background noise about the role of the Irish Republican Brotherhood in the Civil War, and may I speculate why Ginger O'Connell was in Paris may have had something to do with that as well. Before I start, I probably should give you a very brief filling in on where I'm talking about. I'm talking about the 2nd Northern Division, which you can see here, which encompassed most of Tyrone and all of Derry, but there were no IRA in East Derry because there were very few nationalists. This talk will then focus on the number 1, number 2, and number 3 brigades in the 2nd Northern Division. You will see the number 1 brigade is essentially the most nationalist part of Tyrone, and the area which had the longest running Republican tradition of Fenianism, centred on places like Dungannon, Galbally, Kappa, Primrye, Carrickmore. Okay. Number 2 brigade, probably more Hibernian and constitutional nationalist in its politics, but very significant in the story, where the volunteers became particularly strong in a small triangle of villages, mixed villages around Trillick, Dromore and Fintna. And then the number 3 brigade, which you will see there right at the eastern tip of Tyrone, which Killylan joins and which encompasses what's called, where I'm from, the Loch Shore. And that there's actually the Derry Brigade. And the Derry Brigade, the number 3 brigade, are very important in this story. So whenever I refer to number 1, number 2, and number 3, it'll be shorthand for this incredibly brief description of the brigade areas. We're also going to focus on 2 personalities. One personality is in the title of the lecture, Charlie Daly, who was sent as a GHQ organiser to Tyrone. We would suggest he received his orders in August 1920. He was there definitely by September 1920, and the documentary record indicate that he was engaged in a military activity. By October 1920, Charlie Daly goes to GHQ because he's from a prominent Fenian family in Ferries in County Kerry. He subsequently will become a member of the Supreme Council of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, like you could say his political or military nemesis on the right-hand side, Owen O'Duffy, who temporarily takes over as OC of the 2nd Northern Division in March 1921 after the divisional reorganisations, and then leaves, and will subsequently go on to be the Truce Liaison Officer for Ulster, located in St Mary's Hall in Belfast, and then will be the Chief of Staff of the Free State Army and be responsible for expelling Charlie Daly from his command as the officer commanding the 2nd Northern Division on the 2nd of March 1922 at a particularly important meeting in Beggars Bush, which McGallagher, who was the OC of the number 2 brigade in Dromore in County Tyrone, called the Beggars Bush Inquiry, which will be the focus of this talk. So, as usual, I have crammed far too much information into a 20-minute talk, so what I will do is I will give my audience the credit that they can read, and I will not read out for them, and I will generally give a synopsis of what the information says, but we can follow this timeline, okay? And the timeline is quite important. In December 1921, according to Sean O'Murhula, Daly is present on the Supreme Council when Collins comes back from London to show the Dáil Cabinet the draft treaty. He is on the Supreme Council, and both Lynch and O'Duffy collaborate in order to try and create a viable oath. Okay, at the day that Collins apparently signs his death warrant, there's a Caelian Clonus of all places, and at this Caelian Clonus, Owen O'Duffy tells the commandants of all the northern divisions that the treaty is a trick, that it's basically to acquire arms in order to continue the fight, very much in line with what the acts in previous lecture indicated. And then between the 10th and the 18th of January, Daly antagonises Richard Mulcahy during the 2 meetings about IRA unity and the supposed IRA convention. He alerts Mulcahy, who again is also on the Supreme Council, to his very strident opposition to the treaty. And this is the sequence of events which leads to Daly's dismissal. And the wider argument here is that Daly and Joe McKelvey and other leading IRA men, why they're using the agencies of the Irish Republican Brotherhood to construct a joint IRA offensive against the North, are actually excluded from the IRA within the 6 counties. And the speculative sort of conclusion to this is that if you look at it from the perspective of someone like Slavoj Zizek, and I don't want to talk about Slavoj Zizek in a 20-minute talk, there are 2 types of guilt. There are objective guilt, okay, that even though you're good intentioned objectively, at the end you've actually, sort of frustrated your ambitions of unifying the country and achieving a republic, or the subjective guilt. And and that is you always basically intended not to unite the country and perhaps subvert the Republic. The manner in which O'Duffy handles the Baggers Bush inquiry seems to suggest that he engineers the whole thing in order to have the grounds, in order to dismiss Daly, and therefore neutralise the 2nd Northern Division. Again, in 20 minutes, it's not too easy to get through this, but hopefully I will manage. Now, what O'Duffy does is then, as part of the IRB and the Ulster Council managed arms exchange between Liam Lynch and the 1st Southern Division and Baggers Bush, transfer British supplied rifles to the 1st Southern Division. They then transfer them to Baggers Bush, and the old IRA arms are sent north. O'Duffy diverts arms set for Tyrone to the 5th Northern Division in Monaghan because he's trying to maintain the Treaty 8 grip on that division. He then uses the lack of supply of arms in the 2nd Northern, particularly with that number 3 brigade, the Derry Brigade, as a means to try and have grounds to dismiss Daly as the OC of the 2nd Northern Division. This leads then, and this is all in the paper trail in the Irish Military Archive, in the folder on the 2nd Northern Division between Mulcahy and O'Duffy, and this leads then to the meeting in Baggers Bush on the 2nd of March 1922, when Daly is removed and alleges that he's been removed for political, not for military reasons. Quite incredibly then, both men then meet again on the 18th of March 1922 on the Supreme Council, and they decide to have another go at a 2nd Northern offensive, which will, I was going to say eventually take place, but doesn't take place in May. And as a result of this, that Daly then moves to what's called a joint command of 1st and 2nd Northern Division. I know I'm baffling you here with acronyms, but essentially this is the anti-Treaty 8 IRA combined the 1st Northern Division, which is basically Donegal, and the 2nd Northern Division, and hardened fighters from Munster, such under the direction of Liam Lynch, but essentially led by Sean Lahan and people like Mossy Donegan and Charlie Daly, go to Donegal, and they're going to lead both pro and anti-treaty forces in an attack on the north. That has already been alluded to. Daly attends a subsequent IRB Supreme Council meeting on the 19th of April 1922. These are all in the archive, where the Ulster Council then, on the 23rd, according to Padraig Quinn, who's the 4th Northern Division, set the date for the offensive, and the offensive, the Tyrone and Derry IRA allowed to go ahead on the night of the 2nd, the morning of the 3rd of May. No one else goes ahead. The pro-treaty forces in Donegal actually fight with the 1st and 2nd Northern Division, which lead to an incident at Newton Cunningham. And then the incredibly complicated situation in the Bilek and Petticoat Triangle results in a joint force of pro-treaty IRA and anti-treaty IRA from the number 2 Brigade in Dromore, first of all attacking the specials and expelling them, and then coming under attack from the British military, and that very famous night where Lloyd George ordered champagne in order to celebrate the bloodless Battle of Bilek. Okay, so having already used up my 20 minutes, I will perhaps paraphrase what we're going to do, or almost. Daly, the two personalities that we're talking about here in terms of Daly and O'Duffy had very different sort of leadership styles. One endeared himself very much to his men, and the other one antagonised his men. W.J. Kelly, who was the OC of the number 1 Tyrone Brigade, which would be called the East Tyrone Brigade, and who was actually the grandfather of Patrick Kelly, who was killed by the SAS at Loughgall. He was convinced that O'Duffy's appointment in March 21 was a mistake, and that Daly was a better man. And one of the reasons for this is that when O'Duffy comes in, he's a strict disciplinarian. In fact, I think the French military would have been very pleased with Owen O'Duffy. And he introduces what he calls himself Prussianism, and he gives out about the Tyrone IRA and their penchant for drinking poaching and going to Keely's and enjoying themselves, something that privately Owen O'Duffy might have liked himself, amongst other things, but something that proved his own gravitas and respectability, and perhaps turned off an awful lot of the people under his command. Now, what we need to be really clear about here in terms of the 2nd Northern Division is the massive disparity in the two military sides. Right? So since 1914, people were predicting that there was going to be a massive civil war in Tyrone because of the very fine balance of the population, and men are prepared to die for king and throne. I don't know of anyone who's prepared to die for Fermanagh and Tyrone. Well, the reason why, and if you look at O'Halpine and O'Curran's excellent Dead of the Irish Revolution, you see the reason why there's so little political violence in Tyrone is that the disparity in the forces is so complete, is so perhaps insurmountable from the perspective of the IRA. Daly complained that they were operating with a hostile population, about 45% of the population, but in the pre-truce days you had about 100 reasonably well-armed IRA volunteers up against 3,000 well-armed and supplied mixed forces of police and Ulster Special Constabulary. Okay? On top of this, you had a nationalist population which was about a third constitutionalist and two-thirds Republican, and Daly himself, despite his retrospective sort of regard within Tyrone, didn't think an awful lot of our Republican credentials. It's not like a Kerryman, not that like Tyrone men, I know. But anyway, so Daly lamented the slave mind and lack of enthusiasm and military spirit in the population. The division was incredibly poorly armed. Okay, by April 1922, there were 4,300 B specials in Tyrone alone, up against less than 500 well-armed IRA volunteers. O'Duffy admits in March 1922 that they hadn't received one penny from GHQ. Right, in the period of from September 1920 until July 1922, the Ulster Special Constabulary received £6 million from the British Exchequer. Okay, there are 49,000 specials in the six-county area. There's a wee bit of a disparity. We don't have time really to go into the detail of this because I've bitten off more than I can chew as usual. But what we need to talk about then is this meeting, because the meeting is the crux, really, of where we're going. And we'll finish on the meeting, and hopefully you will ask really brilliant questions, and I provide at least not mediocre answers after the talk. So one of the key issues to the creation of the Ulster Council is, in essence, emerges from the Killian Clonus, Frank Aiken, who's the neutral chairman of the council. All of the OCs of the Northern IRA sit on the council, including initially Joe McKelvey and Charlie Daly. O'Duffy organises the first action of the Ulster Council. There's a very famous letter on the 30th of January to Collins about the kidnapping of prominent loyalists in, amongst other places, South Tyrone. And this is purely to consolidate the Treaty 8 position in Monaghan because of the arrest of the Monaghan footballers and because of the people who are sentenced to death in Derry. Okay? One other element of this, okay, and that's the famous letter where he says, we do this, we get 108 votes for the treaty at the Sinn Féin Ardèche. Another element of this is arming the 5th Northern Division at the expense of the 2nd Northern Division. So O'Duffy takes guns that have went through Liam Lynch and diverts them to Monaghan when they were meant to go to Derry. Again, you'll see that this is in the record. He then uses this as the premise to dismiss Charlie Daly, who has expressed his antipathy to the treaty at the meeting on the 2nd of March 1922. Okay, he diverts the arms on the 17th of February. He then tells Mulcahy on the 21st of February, 4 days later, that he's going to get rid of Daly. Okay, but we should not do this immediately because we have to manage it correctly. He gains sanction from Collins on the 10th of March. O'Duffy and Mulcahy then correspond. Mulcahy acknowledges that O'Duffy is dealing with the matter, and then matters came to a head. And what essentially happens is that he gets Sean Haughey, the father of someone who will subsequently develop quite a reputation for himself in Irish politics. He gets him to make a complaint about not arming the volunteers, okay? And he uses this as a premise for Daly's demotion and replacement with Tom Morris. Tom Morris, who's from the South area, okay, has been in jail in England since the autumn of 1920. Daly essentially takes his place as the leader when he arrives as GHQ organiser, and Daly says that O'Duffy knew my attitude towards the treaty and where I would be in the event of a division at the convention for the 26th of March. He then stated that a dual command existed in the division, you having interviewed junior officers and civilians at Beggar's Bush. From my area, without my knowledge, you being in direct communication with one of my brigade OCs, Sean Haughey, newly created number 4 Brigade in Mahara, which was created after the truce, also without my knowledge, and because of the way the meeting of divisional and brigade officers was conducted. Now, this lengthy correspondence is all available in an excellent book edited by myself, amongst other people. Okay, the men will talk to me. This also comes from the Irish Military Archives, and it is also contained in... it also makes use of the pension claims to sort of triangulate the different areas. O'Duffy claimed in a letter, subsequent letter to Mulcahy, that Daly told the assembled officers, "Lads, I knew this was coming as my downfall was planned from the time I accepted the commission from Cathal Brugha." Daly apparently wanted no salary from GHQ and declared that his dismissal was entirely because of his politics. O'Duffy then remarked that none of the 2nd Northern Division officers were politicians, so Charlie obviously took after his ma, and could not understand their commandant's references. All right. Daly claimed that growing discontent among some officers resulted from the increase in demoralisation because of partition and disappointment about supplies of arms. He then recounted how the commander of No. 4 Brigade, Haughey, an IRB centre for Derry, had complained to O'Duffy on the 19th of February, 2 days after O'Duffy had redirected arms. "I am not all surprised. They found that I had deceived them about arms on the strength of promises made by you. I had told them after time that supplies were coming." McGallagher, who also attends this meeting in his pension claim, and we're okay for time, so I'll take the necessary time over this and then I'll conclude. McGallagher testified to giving evidence at the Beggars Bush inquiry regarding Daly's alleged incompetence, which he dismissed as a plot by O'Duffy to replace Daly with a mercenary ex-soldier having little or no pre-truce service, but who was treaty-ate and pliable. And there's the allegedly mercenary ex-soldier there, Tom Morris. Daly then meets both Haughey and Patrick Diamond, who's the brigade chief in the No. 3 Derry. He meets the 2 principal OCs of the Derry IRA, who expressed his regret for the part in the affair and said he was now realised that he had been fooled. He told me that at an interview that he had with you that morning, you informed him that you were not responsible for my removal, but had to do it on instructions from the Minister of Defence, who had taken exception to some statement I had made at a meeting of divisional OCs in Dublin, obviously on the 10th of January. Patrick Diamond, who's OC at No. 3 Brigade, said that O'Duffy had told the new divisional OC, Tom Morris, that he had only been waiting for an opportunity to remove me. Diamond was disgusted with the whole business and that if he saw any more of this crookedness, he would make a clean breast of what he knew. Now, Morris is interviewed and he's in the Leo O'Kane papers in the Cardinal O'Fee Library in Armagh, and he blames the Vice OC in Derry, Dan McKenna, and he says that the allegation was that Charlie Daly was going about Cayley's using IRA funds to have a good time. Okay? Now, why is this? So, where is all this going, you may ask? Where it's all going is that as soon as Daly is removed, O'Duffy, 2 days later, clears the 2nd Northern Division's debts and then arranges the transfers of 100 rifles and 5,000 rounds of ammunition to the 2nd Northern Division. Right? He informs Michael Collins in a letter that he clearly didn't need to be informed about the creation of the Ulster Council, and he mentions Tom Morris, whom he replaced with Daly, whom I found it necessary to displace. Okay, Aiken is chairman of the Ulster Council. A central dump is to be set up in Cavan and McOwen's Midland Division. And then both O'Duffy, Collins and Daly meet again on the 18th of March as members of the IRB Supreme Council. And it's here then that the genesis of the 2nd offensive takes place, because the first abortive offensive in March has petered out. And this then leads, quite faithfully, with 1.5 minutes left, okay, to the 1st and 2nd Northern Division. And here you will see Sean Lahan on the left, Jack Fitzgerald on the right, and there Charlie Daly in the middle. The IRB send these people, Lynch and Collins, to the agencies of Army Unification, send them to Donegal to lead this joint pro- and anti-treaty offensive. Okay? Sean Haughey, of all people, then stocks the 2nd Northern Division with arms through an oil tanker, which comes across the border between Strabane and Lifford. Okay? Again, we don't have the time. Perhaps you can ask some questions if you wish. But essentially what happens is, and if you read both O'Duffy's correspondence and Daly's correspondence, is that the issue of arms and supplies is then manipulated over the following month to convince the IRA and Tyrone in particular, which had been anti-treaty-ite and had sent members to the executive, to come across to Beggars Bush. Okay? And this is Daly's letter. This is, again, is confirmed in the testimony of the Tyrone IRA at the time. Right? This is all premised then on the 2nd offensive. And the second offensive, which is initially set for the night of the 2nd and the morning of the 3rd of May 1922, is cancelled at the last minute, and the only two groupings who take part in this offensive are the 2nd Northern Division, and Daly and Lahan's troops on the Donegal and Derry border. There's approximately, you wouldn't call them 3 brigades, there's about 2.5 brigades. There's 2 actions. It's in returning from a bank raid in Buncrana then that they encounter Free State forces under Joe Sweeney, and rather than collaborating and cooperating with the Republicans, Sweeney's troops attack, and this leads to the Newton Cunningham incident. And again, the documentary record and Daly's correspondence is very good on this. And they meet with Sweeney after Newton Cunningham, and they said if both Free State and, excuse the typo, Republicans may concentrate on Ulster, there will be no fighting amongst themselves in the south, but a few matters like McGowan are the cause of the whole trouble. He told Sweeney that they never came to Donegal to fight him, and that if his HQ were not going to fight in the 6 counties, they shouldn't interfere with us. Sweeney told them that he was the accepted authority, that there was no position to cooperate with them. And Sweeney later claimed to Ernie O'Malley that he had no use for the North, where he thought they were no good. I got no encouragement from Collins or from GHQ about helping the North, nor had I any instructions to back them up. Joe Sweeney was the county centre of the IRB for Donegal. Sean Haughey was the county centre of the IRB for Derry. So, with a minute and 20 seconds over, I will leave it up to your own judgment whether or not we are talking about objective guilt or subjective guilt in terms of where the Free State Army and the leadership of the Irish Republican Brotherhood were going with their northern offensive. What we do know is that at the subsequent date of rising in Belfast, there was no further offensive, and that essentially the Northern IRA were corralled in Keene Barracks, and the only grouping within the 6 counties who perhaps militarily could have challenged the establishment of Craig's government hardly fired a shot. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. The British Army evacuation of Victoria Barracks here in Cork on the 18th of May 1922 and its occupation by the Irish Republican Army, or IRA, was the result of a major compromise agreed between officers on both sides of the Anglo-Irish Treaty Divide. It was also part of a wider effort then being made by some IRA officers to prevent an outbreak of civil war. This paper examines the factors that led to that compromise, its details, the individuals involved, the evacuation and occupation of the barracks, and the aftermath. On the 12th of May 1922, Major General Edward Peter Strickland, the British General Officer commanding the 6th Division, whose headquarters was at Victoria Barracks, made the following entry in his diary, quote, "Orders at PM yesterday for us all to clear out early on the 18th. It's a bombshell." For General Strickland, the order was indeed a bombshell, as, from a military perspective, to vacate Victoria Barracks was to lose it. First occupied in 1806, it was one of the largest military installations in the south of Ireland, with accommodation for over 2,000 troops and stabling for 200 horses. Unlike other barracks, it was never associated with one particular regiment. Instead, because of its access to Cork Harbour and the extensive railway network in the city, it acted as a staging post for British troops heading off to war or to serve in some far-off outpost of the British Empire. In addition to this, located as it was high on a hill overlooking Cork, or the city, the barracks was also a potent symbol of British sovereignty over Cork, and its garrison had played a major role in the fight against the forces of the Irish Republic. During the 1916 rising, troops in the barracks, surrounded the headquarters of the Cork Brigade of Irish Volunteers here in the city to prevent that unit taking part in the rebellion. After the rising, Thomas Kent, a volunteer officer from Castlelyons, County Cork, was executed by a British Army firing squad in the detention barracks. And during the War of Independence, the barracks held the headquarters of the British Army's 6th Division, which covered the province of Munster, and the 17th Brigade, which had the city and county of Cork as its area of operations, and Bernard Law Montgomery as its operations officer. K Company of the Auxiliary Division of the RIC was also based in the barracks. It was this unit that carried out the arson attack in December 1920 that became known as the Burning of Cork. And in the first 5 months of 1921, 13 members of the IRA were executed in the detention barracks. These men were buried in a mass grave what was then Cork Prison, but is now part of this campus, of the campus of this college, and is located not far from where we are now. The British evacuation of the barracks would be carried out in accordance with the terms of the Anglo-Irish Treaty, which ended the War of Independence and provided for the creation of a 26-county Irish Free State. However, by the time General Strickland received his evacuation order on the 11th of May, the dark clouds of civil war were gathering over Ireland. The treaty had caused deep divisions in Ireland's Republican movement. After the Sinn Féin deputies in the Irish Separatist Parliament, Dáil Éireann, approved the treaty by a margin of 7 votes on the 7th of January 1922, the party split. President Eamon de Valera resigned, and a new pro-treaty administration led by Arthur Griffith was formed. However, as the British refused to recognise the authority of the Dáil, a provisional government led by Michael Collins was formed on the 14th of January to implement the terms of the treaty. 2 days later, Collins and members of that government took over Dublin Castle from the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. And since then, it had been using all the means at its disposal to extend its authority to other parts of the 26 counties. And in the meantime, de Valera and his supporters had opened a political campaign designed to undermine the treaty and to strangle the Free State at birth. The treaty also caused divisions in the ranks of the IRA. While 9 of the 13 members of its general headquarters supported it, it is estimated that between 70 and 75% of the 115,000 members it had in July 1921 were against the treaty. On the 26th of March and the 9th of April, the IRA formally split when anti-treaty officers held conventions in Dublin, during which they reaffirmed their commitment to the Republic, repudiated their allegiance to the Dáil and IRA General Headquarters, and put the organisation under the control of its own executive. There was now an IRA committed to maintaining the Irish Republic, declared in 1916, and a pro-treaty force, which soon became known as the National Army, that was committed to establishing an Irish Free State, with both organisations holding completely different objectives. It was proving increasingly difficult to keep the peace and to prevent a drift towards civil war. The previous February, a tense standoff had developed in Limerick when pro- and anti-treaty forces entered the city to take over its barracks when they were vacated by the British. On this occasion, it took the intervention of Generals Richard Mulcahy, the pro-treaty Minister for Defence in Dáil Éireann, and Liam Lynch, the commander of the IRA's anti-treaty 1st Southern Division, to defuse the situation. Actions by some IRA units had also put the truce that then existed between Britain and Ireland in jeopardy. What can be considered to be 2 of the most flagrant violations of the truce were carried out by Cork No. 1 Brigade, which was led by Sean O'Hagerty. On the 29th of March 1922, members of the brigade intercepted a British Admiralty ship, Upner, off the southern coast of Ireland and removed the large cargo of arms and ammunition it was transporting back to Britain. Then, on the 26th of April, in an incident that led to the delay in the British evacuation of Victoria Barracks, 3 British Army intelligence officers and their driver were arrested in Hotel Macroom, County Cork, and executed by the IRA 3 days later. Nationally, the situation had deteriorated further on the 14th of April, when anti-treaty volunteers occupied the forecourts and other buildings in Dublin. And by the end of that month, gunfire was being exchanged by pro- and anti-treaty forces in Kilkenny. Civil war now seemed a real possibility. In an effort to prevent this, on the 1st of May, 10 senior IRA officers, 5 from both sides of the treaty divide, issued what became known as the Army document. In this, they acknowledged the gravity of the situation and outlined a number of proposals that they believed would form the basis for unity. These included an acceptance that a majority in Ireland were in favour of the treaty and the holding of an agreed election with the view to forming a government that would have the confidence of the people. One of those who signed the Army document was Sean O'Hagerty, the commander of Cork No. 1 Brigade. To many, O'Hagerty would be seen as someone unlikely to compromise. Born in Cork in 1881, he was a founding member of the Cork Brigade of Irish Volunteers and a senior member of the Irish Republican Brotherhood. Described as decisive, quick-witted and sharp-tongued, after the death of Terence McSweeney and hunger strike in October 1920, he became the 3rd commanding officer of Cork No. 1 Brigade. A staunch Republican, in December 1921, he wrote to all TDs in his brigade area demanding that they vote against the treaty, and he had absolutely no difficulty placing the truce in jeopardy by authorising operations like the hijacking of the Upnor. Notwithstanding his Republican convictions, by the end of April, the possibility of an outbreak of civil war had become a major concern to O'Hagerty. On the 3rd of May, he addressed a sitting of the Dáil, where, in an impassioned speech, he outlined the dangers facing the country and appealed to the deputies to consider the proposals contained in the Army document. In response, the Dáil set up a committee of 10 deputies to examine the proposals, but on the 11th of May, its Republican members reported that it had failed to reach an agreement. It was on that day that General Strickland received an order to vacate Victoria Barracks. The British evacuation of the barracks presented Minister for Defence Richard Mulcahy with a major problem. Cork was an IRA stronghold, and any attempt to send pro-treaty troops to occupy the barracks might be met with force and lead to civil war. It was with this in mind, and in the spirit of the search for army unity that was then underway, that he negotiated an agreement with Sean O'Hagerty, whereby a pro-treaty army officer representing the provisional government would officially take over the barracks from the British, but after they departed, he would hand it over to O'Hagerty. In return, O'Hagerty agreed to the following undertakings, which were listed in the document Mulcahy sent to him on the 12th of May. 1. Cork No. 1 Brigade would maintain public order. 2. In the event of a contested election taking place, the brigade would ensure that it was carried out uninterrupted. 3. After the election, the brigade would approach the issue of unity in the spirit of the Army document. 4. Policing of the area would be arranged with National Army General Headquarters. 5. Difficulties with pro-treaty members of the brigade would be approached in a generous spirit. 6. The brigade would attend to the routine requirements of General Headquarters. 7. Brigade expenses, including pay, would be forwarded to General Headquarters for consideration. 8. Antagonism to the newly formed police force or civic guard would be faced with a view to it being overcome. And 9. General Headquarters would be responsible for equipping and rationing the IRA garrison of the barracks. This agreement represented a major risk for O'Hagerty and Mulcahy. From Mulcahy's perspective, he was given his potential opponents possession of, in Cork No. 1 Brigade, a large military asset that it could utilise in the event of civil war. For his part, O'Hagerty was allowing members of his unit to be accommodated, equipped, and perhaps more importantly, paid by the National Army, something that might, in the long term, undermine their loyalty to the IRA. While this agreement was being worked out, the British were preparing to vacate Victoria Barracks. On the 17th of May, General Strickland made the following entry in his diary, which recorded his outrage at this turn of events. Quote, "And so, this is the end of 2.5 years' toil. A year ago, we had a perfect organisation and had them beat. They knew this, a short time more would have completed it thoroughly. They knew this and got the politicians to negotiate with the present results. Never has the country been in such a state. All our labours and energy have been thrown in the gutter. It makes one wish one had never been concerned in the show." End quote. From these words, I believe it was clear that Strickland believed the IRA was on the verge of a defeat. But by then, it was too late. On the morning of the 18th of May 1922, an air of expectation filled the city of Cork. At 4 p.m., the last British garrison, comprised of headquarters personnel, support units, and members of the Hampshire, York, and North Staffordshire regiments, formed up on the barrack square. 1 hour later, an advance party arrived at the barracks, accompanied by Captain Hugh MacNeill, the National Army officer who was representing the provisional governments. MacNeill was met by Captain J.G. McGahey of the Royal Engineers, who took him on an inspection of the barracks. As he walked along the barrack square, MacNeill noticed that the Union Jack flag had been lowered, and in an action that would provide one of the most iconic Cork photographs of the era, some British soldiers were cutting down the flagpole. When he objected to this, an officer informed him that it was customary to cut down the flagpole when evacuating a barracks. However, at the same time, MacNeill heard another soldier mutter that, having flown the Union Jack, it would be unbecoming for the pole to fly a rebel flag. MacNeill finished his inspection at 6:30 p.m. By then, hundreds of people had gathered outside the main gate on the Old Yall Road to witness one of the most historic events in the history of Cork. Finally, at 7 p.m., the senior officer gave the order, and the British garrison marched out of Victoria Barracks and out of Cork for the last time. Many in the crowd cheered as the soldiers marched down to Customs House Quay, where a ship was waiting to take them back to Britain. As the last column passed through the gate, Captain McGahey handed the keys of the barracks to Hugh MacNeill, and with this small gesture, he marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. An hour later, 200 members of Cork No. 1 Brigade, led by the volunteer pipe band, marched through the main gate and onto the barrack square, where Captain MacNeill gave the keys of the barracks to Sean O'Hagerty. After the IRA took possession of Victoria Barracks, the crowds outside gradually dispersed. That night, there were probably many in Cork who hoped that the day's historic events would mark the start of a new era of peace and prosperity. Unfortunately, it was not to be. The compromise that led to the peaceful IRA occupation of Victoria Barracks, together with all the other attempts, both political and military, to unify the Republican movement, were destined to fail. 1 month later, Ireland would be plunged into civil war, a conflict that would divide the nation and turn former comrades into bitter enemies. The two men who were instrumental in the IRA occupation of the barracks would take a different path during the Civil War. Richard Mulcahy would become Commander-in-Chief of the National Army following the death of Michael Collins in August 1922. He would later go on to be demonized by Republicans for his part in the Provisional Government's policy of execution, and he would resign from the Cabinet after the 1924 Army Mutiny. Sean O'Hagerty didn't take any part in the Civil War. He resigned from the IRA when it started, and later that year, together with his former adjutant Florence O'Donoghue, he helped establish the Neutral IRA, an organisation comprised of members who were committed to finding a way to end the conflict. So what conclusions can we draw from this story? Well, first of all, in the context of this panel on imperial implications, I believe General Strickland's diary entries can be seen as evidence of the fury felt by senior members of the British military establishment at the dismemberment, because that's what it was, of the United Kingdom, and also at having to effectively surrender installations like Victoria Barracks to an enemy they believed was on its last legs. Secondly, I believe the fact that Richard Mulcahy and Sean O'Hagerty were willing to take risks and negotiate a compromise that would allow one of the strongest units in the IRA occupy a large, strategically situated installation like Victoria Barracks is firm evidence of the sincerity of those on both sides of the treaty divide who were trying to restore unity to the Republican movement. I also believe that it is an indication, just 6 weeks before it started, that Ireland's civil war was not inevitable. I'll finish by returning to Victoria Barracks. On the 11th of August 1922, it would be put to the torch by the IRA in the closing stages of the Battle for Cork to prevent it falling into the hands of their opponents in the National Army. Though completely destroyed, it would be occupied by the National Army before the Civil War ended and renamed after Michael Collins. A programme of reconstruction would also commence that would see it restored to its former glory. And today, Collins Barracks is one of the largest installations occupied by the Irish Defence Forces. It is home to 1 Brigade headquarters and many of its operational and support units. And on a personal note, it was also my home away from home for 43 years. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, everyone, for that. We're going to open the floor to questions now. So if you have any questions for any of our three speakers, or indeed a question that might bridge together some of those topics from north to south to external, we had a nice gamut across various different aspects of that. So are there any questions in the audience? Or well, yes, I see a question over here. We'll just wait for the mic to come over.
Thanks very much. That was an absolutely just a panel of riches, really. So thanks to all the speakers. Actually, just had a question to Fergal there. I was just interested in Sean McKeown's kind of role. Obviously, Ona Duffy, his duplicity seems pretty obvious, in terms of his, as you very well described, in terms of him consolidating power within the 26 counties, as opposed to thinking about any genuine kind of northern offensive, and the way he sort of James McKenna and himself and Monaghan kind of consolidated power there, rather than actually thinking about any cross-border incursions in a serious way. I think you clearly nailed that. But I think Sean McKeown's a bit more vague at this point. He sort of turns up in Donegal and sort of seems to kind of rev up some of the National Army for a future border offensive. He's described the British Army intelligence as ripping down a Union Jack from the Belfast Bank in Pettigo and driving around with it tied to the back of his vehicle, sort of to a cheering crowd of soldiers. So he's clearly. I just think McKeown's. I don't know. I'd love to get your views of McKeown and how his kind of thinking moves during this period, or how his, what you think about his actions in Midland Division particularly. And then just as a quick aside, actually I came across something recently about a senior intelligence officer in Donegal is asked to join the National Army at the foundation of the National Army, so way before the Civil War, and he's told not to by his battalion commanding officer because on the basis that he should infiltrate the IRA. He should infiltrate the outside organisation, and he should basically bring men over and provide intelligence on. And that intelligence during the Civil War then proves absolutely invaluable, according to his pension, various officers who are writing in his pension request. So I think there is that just corroborates some of what you're saying. I think, and that there's a lot of disingenuous kind of in First and Northern Division as well, disingenuous behaviour.
Yeah, well, the McGowan is very strange because he gives this famous speech before the March offensive, and he's mentioned in the British cabinet. Because of it, he's derogatorily called former blacksmith and Harmar Greenwood, and he's involved in the raid on Belcoo in March. I think the one you're referring to. He's also then staying up in O'Gorman's hotel there. It's not in Bundoran anymore, actually. When you go into Bundoran, there's Pathfinder Camp in Ballyshannon. That was the Republican headquarters. And he goes on a tour of inspection with Charlie Daly, and that there's in April, and that can be traced then to them doing a tour of inspection in April, and then Daly's subsequent letter then accuses him of dissembling, of kind of, I don't know what he's up to. And I think, while I don't have any specific evidence in the documents about McKeown himself, if you read the Blythe Memorandum for the May offensive, it's very big. It says a decision is taken somewhere that troops on the border aren't going to fight. And the only place where you can really locate that decision then is the triumvirate, or is Collins. And McGowan seems to be in a position where he'd do what he's told. in that perspective, and he doesn't move. He doesn't move at all in May. But then Frank Aiken doesn't move either. He sits on his hands as well in the dock. And I think that the manner in which the May offensive is carried out, the way it's the only two divisions that are allowed to go on. The second Northern Division, Tom Morris subsequently claims in an interview with Leo Kane that the dispatch rider arrived too late for him to call it off. And then the second offensive, again, Belfast, they're essentially sent in to raid Musgrave Barracks, and there's divisional-wide attacks. In fact, there have been the Third Northern Division attacks on the 2nd of May as well, at Truman, places like that there in Randallstown, where they didn't get the message. But on both of those instances, there's absolutely no movement on the border. But if you read you kind of pull triangulate everything together, and the reason why these people from Cork and Kerry are up in Donegal in the first place is that it was anticipated that they would lead the pro-treaty troops under Sweeney in columns across, and that both McGowan and Hogan would lead columns across on the night of the offensive in May. And I think basically, and if you read the anti-treaty testimony about this, they're looking forward to this because they think there's going to precipitate a British intervention, and that's going to bring everybody back together again. That's their plan. And I think that GHQ basically said, look, this is madness because this is completely subverting our objectives. And then you begin to speculate then about what was the nature then of them manipulating the situation and what was the nature of their involvement with the Northern IRA. And it clearly appears like it's a neutralisation policy. It's essentially that this is an issue that's far too hot to handle, and we can't leave these people to their own devices, but we can't arm anti-treatyites. So we need to get rid of Joe McKelvey, and we need to get rid of Charlie Donnelly. And as soon as we've got rid of them, we can arm these people to the teeth, because essentially what we're going to do with someone like Tom Morris is we're going to move them to Donegal on a neutral footing. Then we're going to co-opt the Derry men into the Free State Army, and we're going to leave people who aren't content to join the Free State Army in Keene Barracks. And the Northern issue then is it's neutralised. And I think Billy and Paddy were key to that. I think that if they were prevaricating, and if they thought we're legit about this, the nature of Churchill's actions, although Lloyd George kind of made fun of it at the time, the nature of Churchill's decision to deploy the British military against what is a mixed force. They're Joe Sweeney's troops, and they're also anti-treaty troops. They're mixed forces. I think convinces Collins that it's okay tackling the specials, but we have a choice here, and the ultimate choice then was: is it army unity and attack on the north, or is it facing down Republicans? And I think the decision that he takes on the 28th of June is essentially the outworkings and the logical conclusion of the decision that he'd take on the 6th of December.
Are there any other questions from the floor? Yes, we have one in the centre there.
Just a quick question for Jerome there, and you'll have to forgive me if it was mentioned in the thing and just slipped my mind. But given that you said that France was angling towards London, that it viewed Britain as its main ally against Germany and stuff, did the Deuxième Bureau inform London of Ginger O'Connell's visit, or did they keep that completely quiet?
Excuse me, I don't think he did. I don't know. There is no evidence that the French actually did inform the British on that occasion. The man who was in charge of it, Colonel Fournier, was quite critical towards the British because of the ongoing geostrategic deterioration in the relations between France and Britain at the time, notably that question in Turkey and so on. So I doubt very much that he gave that particular document to the British or his British counterpart. And what the French government did, that I don't know. As I said, it's shrouded in mystery. When I found that document already several years ago, it took me rather by surprise, I have to say. I'm sorry, I simply don't know.
Thank you. And there's another question here, yes.
Could you tell us something, just what happened to Charlie Daly subsequently?
Charlie Daly, then Sean Lahan and Mossy Donegan are collecting guns, or they're actually collecting mines in the forecourts before the bombardment to come north. So once the bombardment happens, Daly is essentially left in command in Donegal. He leads the Republican troops in Donegal. Lahan takes the circuitous route through the entire country. He actually walks to Donegal. And this, I think, is referring back to the personal animosity or perhaps political reasons for Daly's eventual execution. Now, again, I don't think these are mutually exclusive concepts or motivations. I think actually you can ride both horses on this one. If you read The Gates Flew Open and Father O'Donnell, he says in the conversation with Dick Barrett knew too much. He had cons his ear and his plans and the Black Hand and what he was going to do. And O'Donnell also says in his Ernie O'Malley notebook that Charlie Daly was in the Supreme Council, and he was surprised himself that he lived. So what happens, Daly is arrested after Ernie O'Malley gives the evacuation order in Donegal, and again Sweeney accounts to the evidence in the pension files that he basically knew everywhere the Republicans were going. The Republicans were isolated and essentially were in a trap in Donegal. He doesn't face trial until he isn't found guilty until January, and then there's an attack by people after affair in Creasla Barracks, and the available evidence suggests that there's nothing to do with the anti-treaty IRA. In fact, it's people who the Free State soldiers have antagonised during the affair have too much drink in them, and they fire into the barracks. It's at this stage then that, because supposed military action has been taken against the Free State, that the 4 prisoners at Drumbo, including Sean Larkin, who was formerly OC of one of the brigades in South Derry, they're executed. They're executed. The order comes, Sweeney says it's from Gerald O'Sullivan, and but again, Sweeney, evidence is contradictory. And there's a letter from Moss to me to Florrie O'Donoghue when he's doing No Other Law, saying that Sweeney has information on this execution, but his subsequent talks with his men will talk with me and the Curious Journey and any of his retrospective accounts on this basically say that he double checked whether or not the execution was to go through, and the execution, he was ordered to execute them, and that he felt terrible about it because Sweeney and him had been good friends at UCD. But if you look, and again, if you just look at the nature of the people who are executed in this manner, there was no military threat from the anti-treaty IRA in Donegal in this period. They had been ordered to evacuate. There actually was no anti-treaty IRA in Donegal. So what were the motivations then for the execution of Charlie Daly? Well, it would appear that, it would either be because Richard Mackay didn't like him, or because he was a leading member of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, and he perhaps had information that would be very embarrassing to the new government, considering the sort of collaboration between GHQ through the agencies, the IRB, in a campaign against the legitimate authority in the 6 counties. But again, that is speculative.
And I see a question there from John. Yeah, do you want to?
It's a point of information rather than a question. Bill talks about Kevin O'Higgins' signature on a document this morning, and you used the term of trial and standing trial. The Free State Army were operating martial law from the 12th of July onwards. All of these executions were carried out on the principle of military necessity. There were courts and there were committees of officers, and not always, and not in the case of Barrett and McKelvey and so forth in December. But that was really just icing on the cake. It was a safety mechanism. It wasn't applied across the board. And I think it's very often lost that martial law existed during the Civil War. It's very seldom, if ever, referenced. So it's a point of information, actually, but yeah.
I might jump in with a question for Jerry before we might conclude this session. It's interesting looking across 3 papers, referring back to this morning's session, how we discussed how civil war, needs to have 2 clear sides to it. But what we see in all 3 of these papers is actually the prelude to the civil war, and how the sides are working together to try and cooperate, whether that be In France, looking at Irish policy to drive a wedge between the Franco-British alliance. In Cork, incredible stories about how they're actually negotiating the handover and then the re-handover of the barracks. And the situation in the north, I think, is much more complicated, but I could still say, to a certain extent, while there is duplicity and there's double dealing going on, that there is an effort to try and create, I suppose, a united front in that instance. Looking at Cork, Jerry, could you give us a little bit of the aftermath of that? I suppose, we talked here about the lead up to the handover. We did reference the burning out of the barracks, but where do we see the figures within the two sides of the originally united Cork IRA when we come to the Civil War? Is it the same as in Kerry, for instance, that it's the Dublin Brigade and it's external units that are brought in to progress the fight? And how do those animosities come to the surface in Cork, or is there still some brotherhood between former comrades?
Well, for the most part, in this dealing with the Cork No. 1 Brigade here in the city, they were predominantly anti-treaty. And now O'Hagerty, like I said, resigned. He was in his headquarters in Union Quay, the former RIC barracks in Union Quay. The minute he heard that the Civil War broke out, he was out the gate. McLeahy took over from Cove, and Flurry O'Donoghue, who was the former adjutant of the Cork Brigade, then adjutant of the Southern Division, he also left as well. With the exception, I think, of the company as a C company or G company up in Blarney Street, right, which is surprising. They were predominantly pro-treaty, and I think over 100 of those guys went into the National Army. But for the most part, once the fighting started, as to quote Shakespeare, once the dogs of war were unleashed, there was a gathering together then, and like I said, it was predominantly pro-treaty. I know we haven't mentioned the Cumann na mBan. Ironically, the Cumann na mBan here in Cork, the IRA would have been anti-treaty, but the Cumann na mBan were actually pro-treaty. So it was strange enough, So the unity of the overall Republican movement was fractured.
Thanks, Jerry. And with that, I'm going to as we're just at time, I'm going to close up this session for the day. It stands as me as chair, first of all, just to remind you of the sessions tomorrow. So we're kicking off tomorrow's session with 3 parallel sessions in Bull 1, 2 and 4. Nothing in Bull 3 at 9:30, okay? So for those of you who will be here tomorrow, that's your next timing. And it finally stands for me on behalf of the conference organisers and you, the audience, to thank our speakers for 3 fantastic papers this afternoon.